May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Well, this week, we get the second part of a two-part story. Last week, we had the story of David and Uriah. David sending Uriah off to be killed because he had lain with his wife and made her pregnant and couldn't solve his problem as he saw any other way. And this week, we see the results of that choice that David made, or that series of choices, because it wasn't just one choice. He made one mistake, and he followed it up by more mistakes. And God's response is not to tell David, I don't love you anymore, but to tell him that you must live the result of your mistakes. You must live your life the way you chose to live your life. That's a very important message. And it's a really important message today in this world, where we have groups like ISIS rising up in the Middle East. And we have the countries, particularly the US and Canada in North America. Mexico is not really doing anything. But the US and Canada and their response to terrorism in the Middle East. A response of fear and violence. And ISIS itself is a response to violence. Violence that in a way started here on this continent by interfering, by trying to impose a way of life that doesn't fit, and then leaving it alone to see what happens. When David solved his problems with the sword, he lived out the rest of his life under threat of the sword. When we choose to live using violence to solve our problems, the response we are going to get is more violence. And the other response that's happening here, when we choose to live in fear, then fear is what we cause in others. Fear is what we cause in our children. Fear of those that are different. And that's really what this is about. It's a fear of difference. A fear of those who do not believe the same things we believe. And our response of violence and restriction and suspecting that everybody we see that looks different than us might be part of it. It's a choice to live that way. Nothing that we do will immediately change the way other people believe, behave, or feel towards us. But the way that we live will change how we perceive them. The way that we live will change the way that we perceive ourselves. And the way that we live has the potential to change the world over time. We can choose to live in fear and violence, and we will get more fear and more violence. We could choose to live in hope and love, which is way riskier. Because if we choose not to fear, if we choose not to suspect, then we are going to get hurt. Because those that we choose to trust will not always be trustworthy. But if we choose to live in hope and love, then all those who are trustworthy, who we would have been suspecting, they also can live in hope and love, which we take that choice away if we live by violence and by fear. We take that choice away from everyone we run into. So that's what our reading from Samuel today is about. It's David's choice to live by violence, returning to him violence for the rest of his life. It doesn't directly say it, but the other choice he could have made, the choice he could have made to live in love and respect and hope. What would the kingdom of Israel been like in that time if those had been his choices? What can our lives be like if those are our choices? If we choose to live in love and to trust rather than suspect everyone who is different than us. What difference will that make in our community, in those we come across, in our children? The only reason that we don't yet have the kingdom of heaven here on earth is because human beings have chosen not to let it happen. We take our own self-interest and put it before everything else. It's a lot easier to be afraid and to respond to that fear with violence than it is to be hopeful and trusting and loving, knowing that we're likely to get hurt. But that's what it takes to bring about the kingdom of heaven. In our gospel today, Jesus is asked, what works must we do to do the work of God? And Jesus' answer was not what they expected. You don't have to do anything other than believe. You have to believe that the one who is sent is the Son of God and has brought you the message by which to live. And if we look at that message over and over again, it's not pushing away the stranger. It's not living in fear. It's accepting the risk of standing next to the one who is pushed aside. It's accepting the risk that we might die for that. But it's worth it. Because this is the way to God's kingdom. This is the way to get rid of the violence. By living in love and hope and trust. I am the bread of life, he said. Whoever believes in me will never go hungry, will never be thirsty. And in our letter from Paul, I've lost my train of thought. I don't do this often. Paul talks about us all being the same. That no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, no matter what we believe, we are all God's people. There is one God. So when we set people aside because they believe differently than we do, we're doing the same thing. We're committing that violence against God of saying, we know better than you. They're not the same. No. We are all one people. We are all beloved of the same God. And as such, we are all worthy of love. We are all worthy of trust. And we have to choose to live that way if we want any chance of having that come back to us. And with God's help, we can do that. Thanks be to God.